Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are talking about the state of housing in Austin. Starting on October 22nd, Austinites will have a chance to vote on Proposition A to dedicate $250 million toward affordable rent-regulated housing. What impact is this expected to have on the city's economy, and what changes would Austin residents see if this were to pass? Joining us to talk about this, we have Marina Roberts and Maddie Detelich, who are co-chairs of the Housing Committee of the Austin chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Thank you both for coming on.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having.
So can you tell us, first of all, a little bit, how you got started with, the DSA and with the Housing Committee in particular? What got you interested in this, and why do you think it's kind of an important thing for people to be talking about and voting on?
Yeah, well, I guess if we want to just go chronologically, so I've actually been a co-chair since June, and then Marina is just being onboarded in the past month or so, but she's been super involved for basically that whole time. It's interesting that housing does have this black box kind of, that people look at it as like a black box, and like, I know I'm a very technically minded person, and it was frustrating to me that I was watching these conversations, and it's like, but in my heart, I know what the values are associated with housing. So I was confused why it seemed so technical and this complicated thing that people are arguing over, when it's like housing is a human right, and that a lot of people have trouble getting it, and that it's a source of struggle and severe pain for a lot of people. And so yeah, I was pulled into that sphere in the DSA almost out of my own kind of like curiosity, like, why does it have to be so complicated? And then the more I heard, the more interested I got, and came in at the right time and started and jumped on board this bond campaign, and been running ever since.
For me, it was it was something that I kind of stepped into as soon as I joined DSA. And for me, it was something that I didn't immediately connect it to my own personal experiences. It was honestly very similar to Maddie, where I saw housing as this foundational, really fundamental piece of stability for working class families and for regular folks in America, but something that was just weirdly hadn't really been properly politicized for me yet. And then I started doing work on this campaign, and I started kind of learning about housing issues from a political socialist standpoint. And I realized that my own experiences kind of play into this in a big way. My mama has been homeless multiple times in her life. I have a brother who is homeless in the city of Houston right now, and mental illness plays a big role in that. And whenever I was in college, I was homeless for a little bit, in the sense that I couldn't afford housing, and so I was sort of sneaking into dorms, and then sleeping on people's couches and things like that. And so for me, it was just sort of a politicization of my own experiences, and learning about housing in a way that I guess connected the politics of housing to broader struggles about class and justice in America.
I think that's such an important thing, is to understand that, it is fundamentally a political issue. So many people, and especially so many workers, have this, kind of working people who are stuck in like sort of the day to day. We don't often politicize things, I think, as much as they really should, because I don't think for so many people the boundaries of what counts as politics is so narrow. Like, they see this sort of Republican and Democratic, this kind of status quo where there's such a narrow kind of window of what gets even considered considered. And, you know, something like housing is so often way outside that window at this point in history that people don't see it as like, oh yeah, actually housing, the right for people to have access to housing is absolutely a fundamental political issue. So if you know, you're the kind of person who's like, well, I'm not really a political person. Well, if you care about, say, access to you having somewhere to live, a roof over your head, that is fundamentally to me a political issue.
Yeah, one of my favorite things, or little one-liners I've heard in the last year or so is oh, you're not a political person? Well, your landlord is.
Yeah. That's so true. And I mean, I think also looking at it through the lens of housing is a feminist issue, right? People who are stuck in domestic violence situations, a huge piece of that is not being able to exit that housing situation because there's not affordable housing that's readily available to them. There's not emergency housing that's readily available. And then, you know, links between housing instability and recidivism for people who are reentering the community from being incarcerated. That's a huge link there as well with respect to criminal justice and also racial justice. So there are a ton of links that I think, you know, really plainly center this as being a political issue.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm involved in the DSA housing committee and my view of it being housing being this extraordinarily fundamentally political thing is just recognizing that a lot of the reasons why it's so complicated and why it does seem like there's gridlock in certain areas, like with what we've seen in Austin with not to go here too soon, but with Code Next. But it's like realizing that at the heart of the issue is property, you know, and it's like, how do we structure our society in a fair way when we have all of this value tied up in people's land, and then the value of or their assets rely on keeping other people away from them. And yeah, just realizing that we are not going to build a sustainable city that can hold people of various income levels unless we start looking at housing from a socialist perspective.
And, you know, to me, also kind of being a socialist organizer in Austin, I see this a lot where I think so much of Austin and so much of Texas and so much of the South generally is a surprisingly fertile ground for socialist organizing because it's needed so badly.
Yes.
Because you know, we have such a lack of unions here. We have such a lack of representation in general. We have such a lack of real kind of that sort of infrastructure for the oppressed to fight back. There are not many mechanisms here within the South, broadly speaking, for workers to, you know, have that kind of power to balance out, you know, that of the ruling class in so many ways. So like I think that that bringing that socialist perspective is really important. And of course, when we're talking about housing, we're talking about kind of an absolute artificial scarcity. The fact that there's so much construction within this city, for instance, and that we see so many of these very expensive apartments going up, these sort of boxy earth tone apartments everywhere, and so many of them now kind of sit empty. I saw an interesting sort of point recently where housing is actually getting cheaper for the rich while more expensive for the poor. I'm not sure if you had kind of run across that. That kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like they're building all of these boxy earth tone apartments and whatnot. They're building all of these things that are way outside the affordability range of kind of working class people. And yet, you know, again, like the housing at the bottom continues to rise while all of this kind of these luxury apartments, you know, the price on those actually is either, you know, falling or remaining stable, you know, countrywide.
Right.
So, applied to the position, applied to the situation here in Austin, what are we looking at with the kind of solution proposed here with the $250 million housing bond? What do you hope that this will accomplish?
Sure. I think my first response to that is just that what we're seeing in terms of housing development in Austin is very much just a symptom of capitalism. I mean, if you look nationwide, the entire country is in a housing crisis. And so we can kind of look at Austin as being a neat little microcosm of that, where capitalists are going to continue to build housing for the rich because that is more profitable than developing housing for working class people. And if we were really going to take Austin's affordable housing shortage seriously, solving that would cost $6 billion. So that's something that, is going to require a much more sustained effort over time and a lot more investment from the city. But I think that something that the DSA Housing Committee, has a very strong consensus on is that the solution to this problem is, it lies in, strictly anti-capitalist solutions, right? So it lies in decommodifying housing, meaning removing housing from the private market. So if we want to stop property values from rising so far out of control that, nobody can afford to live here, rents rising out of control, the only way to kind of stave off that upward pressure on rent is to remove housing from the speculation of the private market. So that's kind of, the solutions that we were talking about are things like, with respect to the bond, it's $100 million of that $250 million affordable housing bond will go toward acquiring land. So the city will acquire land. So that is removing land from the private market. And on that land, we can build, affordable housing. We can partner with nonprofits. We can kind of begin to solve that problem from a social housing perspective and not a profitability perspective.
One point I'd like to add there is just that the housing as you were saying, in Texas, we have so much of an ingrained structure that's keeping the working class disorganized. And one of that is this, a lot of tenant protections are actually illegal or from the state, or
preempted.
Right,
yeah. Right.
And so a lot of other organizations across, or DSA chapters across the states are focusing on tenant organizing and stuff. And I did have a good conversation about how we can begin that once this bond is passed. But unfortunately, my bubble was burst to find out that a lot of stuff that you can do in other states, you just simply can't do here because of the it's just baked into the system to just be bad, to be a renter, to be a working class person in Texas.
Right. Those things that you were talking about earlier that are, not available to the working class. Tenant protections in Texas is very much one of them.
Right. And then so I was going to say that, so with this bond is that the money, or what was it, that the housing that gets built with this bond money does get tenant protection, at least the tenant protection of just cause eviction. And what was the other one?
Just cause eviction is a big one. That's the thing that I think a lot of people don't even realize that renters in Texas don't already have, where, if your landlord decides to evict you, they don't have to have just cause for making that decision. So tenants and renters in the state of Texas are very much at the mercy of their landlords in terms of what rights they have. And I think that that's very important to recognize and to consider whenever we're talking about Austin, where more than half of the folks living in our city are renting. So that's a sizable portion of our city relative to other cities.
So just to, kind of reiterate what we're talking about, we have more than 50% of people who are renting, who do not own the property they're living on, and who have absolutely really zero protection as to their kind of housing situation. They can be evicted for more or less any reason, if I'm understanding this correctly.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where, obviously, considering that a lease is going to have certain language with respect to what process the landlord has to undergo, the amount of notice that the landlord has to give prior to evicting a tenant, as long as those guidelines are followed, to my knowledge, yes, a landlord can evict a tenant without having to provide any kind of just cause in the state of Texas. But if the bond passes and properties are built with bond money, then those properties will afford these kinds of protections to tenants. And that's very important, like Maddie was saying, because that allows DSA to potentially engage in, and other housing organizations to potentially engage in more earnest tenant organizing in the future.
Yeah, I think there's this sort of false dichotomy that's put up again, where people consider electoral victories or this sort of electoral organizing as something completely separate from and not related to in any way the kind of on the ground really workers and tenants organizing. And I think that the truth is there's always a balance being struck there. Because we see that when you're kind of outreaching people, whatever that sort of outreach looks like, that gives you a chance to connect to people, not just electorally, not just for the sake of voting for the thing and getting the thing, however important the thing may be. But the truth is that sort of on the ground organizing also gives people a chance to connect not just with other people as voters, but with other people as workers, as tenants. Essentially, electoral organizing is movement building. And kind of the various kind of roles that electoral organizing plays. It's not just really about, or at least it shouldn't be about, because I feel like that in many ways is where the Democratic Party has kind of failed in it just and other sort of political parties have also failed when they see the electoral organizing as the end in itself. Mm-hmm. If you believe that the system can be reformed simply through the electoral politics and not through then organizing the kind of workers and the tenants to kind of build that alternative power structure, build a sort of dual power, if you want to call it that. I'm not sure how you kind of see it within the framework of the DSA or within the generally kind of the mission of this the Austin Prop 1.
Yeah, so this is definitely a much talked about subject in our chapter. And I want to start by emphasizing that the bond itself, the $250 million, is going to have real material impacts on people's lives, which is, great. And we're excited about that. And our members were essential to pushing the city from the point where is 85 million too much to hell yeah, we're doing 250 million after we pushed them with, we held 300, we pushed them with 300. So we're definitely excited about that dollar amount that's going to be going to building affordable units, thousands of affordable units for people to live in, or homes, sorry. Unit is wonk speak. But anyway, but yeah, that being said, we're also out there like every weekend, and at least a couple weekends ago, 3 days of a weekend, because we believe in it as a movement. And considering the state of where the national consciousness is on any kind of like public housing, even though, as we were talking about earlier, housing is this fundamental thing to all of our lives, and we all experience how difficult it is. Or I say all, but I mean everyone everyone I know is this fundamental thing that we feel, and it hurts us and it causes us so much more stress than it has to. Yet the kind of predominant political will in this country at a national and state level is that public housing is just dead. I got kind of like an interesting window into this earlier in the year when I was working for the state environmental agency, and every now and then I would get kind of random phone calls from people calling about the quality of their water. Sometimes they would end up at my desk, even though that was not my department at all. But I was sitting and listening to this woman talking about, like, she was so concerned, like her sister was living in public housing outside of Houston, and she was worried about the quality of the water, asking me how she could find out. And I swear this has a point. But it's the way she spoke about public housing, it was like a poisonous word on her tongue. And the way she spoke about the state agency, it's just unconscionable evil. Like, and yet she mentioned, her sister is had mental health issues, was living on a fixed income, and had nowhere else to go. And so there was this interesting perspective of, like, when it comes down to it, people believe that people deserve a roof over their heads, especially people that they know. And not just a roof over their heads, but like one that's comfortable and not making them sick. So it's interesting how it's this intuitive thing to people, despite the predominant forces being no public housing, and the public housing we have is trash anyways. Yeah, so it's really great being out there and talking to people about, like, we believe that housing is a human right, and like we know that we need a lot more social change in our country and political change in our country if we ever want to see truly just social housing models and that exist in places in the world. But building more options for people, building more affordable units feels like the right place to start.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And really, if you want to win people over, you have to show them something. You have to show them a victory. You can talk all day about socialism. You can talk all day about the sort of ideals. But if you're not willing to kind of put the work in to first of all sort of educate yourself about the socialist states, what a socialist state could look like, and then also be able to kind of share that with people, but then also be able to show people that you're on their side are two such really important things to winning over people's movement. And I think, I feel like what you were talking about a little bit here was this sort of this clash of experiences that people have, where on the one hand, people in their kind of experiences with homelessness or borderline homelessness, or, the fact that as we've said, more than 50% of people do not own the land that they're currently inhabiting, the land they're living on. So many people are so very close to homelessness, and that affects people's consciousness, where they feel that they should not, rightly, that they should not have to struggle to keep a roof over their heads in such a kind of devastating way. But that consciousness clashes with the sort of, lackluster infrastructure so often provided by a capitalist state that sort of really just, when capitalist states, when they do provide some sort of a safety net or whatnot, they usually provide at the bare minimum with so much of that kind of systemic oppression, replicated in some way or another. They,
like a beggars can't be choosers kind of model.
Mm-hmm. Basically, it's we're going to provide the bare minimum we have to without cutting into the profits of the ruling class so often under capitalism, when essentially the people in charge of the system are the quote unquote 1%, or whatever it is you want to call it. We see this sort of thing with education. So many people fought so hard for the right to an education. First of all, the right to kind of the public schools, the right to access to college and whatnot. And what we see when, that under a capitalist system, under a system where essentially there's this kind of for-profit economic model where a certain class of people can accumulate infinite wealth at the expense of the rest of the people, is that these systems, no matter how kind of well, no matter how much they're fought for, they always have to keep being refought for as long as the same economic system is in place. It'll continue to sort of tear this down and tear this down and tear this down. If we're not constantly sort of vigilant, if we're not constantly trying to, move that forward, to show people kind of, to expand people's horizons, like we can demand something better. So let's bring this conversation back to, once again, the housing bond, because locally in Austin, I think a lot of people are often skeptical of bond packages, because we have seen things such as Austin Independent School District kind of reneged on many of their pledges not to start closing schools when they successfully got people to vote for essentially $1 billion bond package, because everybody wants to fund public schools. But what we saw with AISD is that there was that sort of a reneging on that promise. In many ways, it left people feeling very
disillusioned.
Yeah. So with this bond package, what are sort of the promises being made, and how do you see that being implemented, in a kind of more positive way?
I think the first thing is that I think it's fair for people to sort of have that skepticism because of their experiences with government, right? Their experiences being disillusioned with candidates and with promises and things like that. But I think that what makes this, Prop A distinct in my mind is the fact that it was fought for by this very grassroots mobilization of people. Through DSA and our partner organizations with, grassroots leadership and workers' defense. This wasn't sort of worked out through, city council people and individuals kind of, manipulating the process. It was ultimately a bunch of organizers who wanted to see Austin's housing crisis get addressed. And so a lot of that same skepticism, I will say, was kind of expressed maybe at our general body meeting where we endorsed Prop A. But we had Council Member Greg Kazar come and speak at that meeting, and he spoke about how there was an equity analysis done, about how the money will be spent equitably throughout Austin. It's not just going to go into development on the east side. He spoke to how, in his mind, it was going to be one of the most equalizing propositions on the ballot in November. But ultimately, I think more to your point about how the money will be spent and how we can create accountability there, part of the kind of the pledge and part of the strategy of our campaign ultimately is to kind of have some follow through, right? To kind of keep up with this money once we win it. So we are going to win this, this election, for Prop A, we are going to win that on the ballot in November. But once we're done with this election process, we're going to continue to pay attention. We're going to watch how the money gets spent. We're going to watch city council. We're going to watch the kinds of developments that this money will go to. And if we see the money being spent in a way that we feel doesn't generate equity in our city and housing justice in our city, then we are going to kind of, reach out to the 13 different housing and housing and justice organizations that we partnered with. And we're going to mobilize people to go to city council and, make a ruckus. So I think that that's the difference, right? Is that whenever you have something that got put on the ballot in the first place through a mobilization of people, then there's a lot more accountability because all of the elected officials are keenly aware of the fact that Prop A wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be a $250 million affordable housing bond without us. And so the way that they spend that money is accountable to people in a way that I think a lot of other things aren't.
And I'd like to add just one component of the actual, I think, that there was a lot of organizing involved with getting it on. There was a lot of organizing involved with getting it on the ballot, but also just this campaign process itself. Every weekend that we bring in new faces to canvass on a voluntary basis, they decide to spend half of their weekend day with us. And they're getting out there, they're learning as they go the details of this bond. They're seeing the people who need it the most firsthand. And I'd like to think that I'd like to hope that all of these people, these new canvassers that we're training, are getting themselves personally invested in this process.
Welcome back to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. I, of course, am Brian Griffith, and I am joined in studio once again by Marina Roberts and Maddie Detelich, the co-chairs of the Housing Committee of the Austin chapter of DSA. Thank you both for coming on once again.
Thanks for having us.
So let's get into the weeds of what this housing bond is all about. I'm looking at a kind of DSA flyer that was put out for this. That's covering how will the bond funds be spent. Of course, we're talking about a $250 million housing bonds that should help with affordable housing here in Austin, and it's pointing out how will the bond funds be spent. And it says it's going to be spent in 4 key ways. The first is developing affordable rent-regulated apartments, including permanent supportive housing. It also says developing affordably priced houses for home ownership, home repair and rehab funds for low to moderate income homeowners. And finally, for a major new initiative for public purchase of land to use for affordable housing developments. So I feel like they're, those are 4 very distinct intents, I feel like. And we've already talked a little bit. And I'd like to, at some point, circle back around to maybe the challenges that, tenant organizers face. But for now, talking about what the actual bond covers, it feels like there are 4 distinct intents that kind of are targeting different people. Where, when we're talking about, for instance, the control of rent, the regulation of rent for that more than 50% of Austinites who are renting their living quarters. That's a much different kind of intent than trying to, what it seems like would be develop or subsidize, houses for home ownership, where I feel like that kind of goes to two kind of different classes of people with different kind of interests in mind. So can you maybe speak to that a little bit and, about how this came together and how you kind of foresee that playing out?
Yeah, sure. So I think a useful thing to clarify here is that the lion's share of the money in the affordable housing bond will go toward, acquisition of land. So these other programs that we're kind of talking about are kind of addressing housing needs that do exist in Austin. And they may not seem sort of like very intuitive, I guess, from a socialist lens as far as furthering that cause. But I guess for me personally, one of the most interesting points of contention to navigate in housing justice organizing has been that sort of tension between maybe people who want to organize tenants and people who want to fight for housing justice and create more socialized housing and come up with these sort of anti-capitalist solutions to housing that don't center on, privatization of land and looking at housing as a commodity. And then, on the other side of that, low-income homeowners who are just being sort of displaced and forced out and are sort of at the mercy of gentrification and sort of like are just trying to push back against that and find a way to continue to live in their communities. And so for me, I think that I can absolutely acknowledge, I think that it's a very logical starting point to kind of look at that issue of like, if you're looking at a low income community full of homeowners who are just trying to hold on and who had to fight really hard to get there. I just think that we have to kind of continue and kind of take that analysis a little bit further, right? Because what's driving their displacement is capitalism. It's not property taxes. Property taxes is a sort of mechanism for gentrification, but capitalism and the private property of homes, the commoditization of homes, and looking at homes as an investment vehicle for wealthy people, for capitalists. That's what's driving, I think, a lot of these issues. I think that at the end of the day, rising property values and upward pressures on rents and gentrification of certain areas that have suddenly become desirable to capitalists because there's a lot of cheap land there. Those are all symptoms and consequences of capitalism. And I think that we don't resolve those tensions on a permanent basis without enlisting the tools that are available to us outside the framework of capitalism, things like community land trusts, and socialized housing, like publicly owned housing, kind of like Maddie was talking about. Those are the more permanent solutions, I think, that could actually protect low-income homeowners on a more permanent basis. I think that the solutions that involve just pushing back on property taxes are a little bit misguided and aren't going to permanently protect the most vulnerable members of our community.
Yeah, it's tough to think about homeownership when you're advocating for a total paradigm shift of the economic structures of our country, because I mean, homeownership being the vehicle of wealth accumulation in our country, it wasn't an accident. Like this was all planned and it's created by government programs. So it's like something we could imagine a different way to create stability in our society. But unfortunately, there are so many institutions that are set up to make it that, yeah, if you are, especially I can imagine as you're talking off air, like in education, if you are in this locked in, or if your career is something that's not making a lot of money, and you can get access to these government supported mortgage programs and get a home, so you know that your rent is not, or so that you know your payment year to year is going to stay relatively stable. Yeah, I don't blame you. And so, especially with the pressures of rent on our city, that's just in our society where rent is not addressed sufficiently. And what I like to say is like, yeah, with as far as property taxes going up every year, for renters, like it's a near certainty that your rent is going to go up every year, and it could jump way beyond what your wage is. Well, a lot of wages don't go up every year, so.
Yeah, there's very much that sort of disconnect between the rent going up and the wages going up. I've felt that as much as anyone. I've been kind of forced from the center, more central Austin, to kind of weigh on the periphery of that sort of thing. I also want to kind of mention that if we, and this is a little tangential, but if we look at what many real estate companies are attempting to do, the sort of older model was that real estate companies would very often buy property or buy houses with the intent of reselling them. But we are seeing a paradigm shift right now where several of the major kind of real estate companies within the country are now looking simply to purchase homes for the sake of renting them, purchase property that at one point would have been sold into private ownership because they simply believe that home ownership is going to be a thing of the past. They believe that more and more we're going to be moving to the rent model, and in a certain way they're going to create this self-fulfilling prophecy by doing that, by buying up all the land and forcing people to a rent model.
Wow.
I think that people can understand that economics always kind of tightens the belt around us, always makes home ownership more unstable, while also kind of recognizing that there's when we're talking about home ownership, we're talking about such a massive disparity between kind of the poorest homeowners and the wealthiest homeowners. I know, for instance, a lot of teachers who have lived in Austin, since the 1970s or whatnot. They have owned very, very modest homes of 600 square feet or something to that effect, and have watched themselves slowly get kind of priced out as the land around them through no fault of their own. Increases in value. The property taxes go up, their wages stay stagnant, whatever the case is. Understanding that that's a much different phenomenon than the these real estate companies buying up these massive tracts of land, but ultimately that needle always kind of tips toward the real estate companies. But it's always so important to stand in solidarity with working people, regardless. You can be a worker and you can be a homeowner. Those are not within the kind of U.S. context. Within the context of the South, home ownership has not always kind of equated to wealth in any sort of way that I've seen, having grown up, especially kind of in the rural South.
Right. When a lot of people live on a good chunk of land and own their homes, and doesn't necessarily mean they are the 1%.
One kind of interesting thing that I kind of, uncovered whenever I was looking into a lot of like housing statistics and things in Austin, though, is I mentioned earlier that statistic about more than half of Austinites are renters. And of that category, there is like, I think that there are certain wealth disparities that are just very much exacerbated that you kind of see really clearly specifically between renters and homeowners, where Austin is less than 50% white, but of the category of homeowners, you have, I think, a 2/3% of them are white folks. And then the median family income among homeowners is more than double what the median family income of renters is. So I guess I would just say that with respect to the bond, the programs that are designed to alleviate the struggles of renters, I think that those are well-placed priorities, mostly because the renting class, I guess you could call them, are I think just in material terms, much more vulnerable than the class of homeowners, because whenever a renter gets kicked out of their home, then they don't get a bonus check from their, hugely appreciated property as a party gift, So, I mean, if and that's certainly not to say that homeowners don't deserve protection, right? I just think that the sort of tactics that we use to protect people from gentrification need to be rethought in a socialist context, in a sort of like look at the drivers of capital and like who is trying to gentrify their areas and to what ends and that kind of thing. And I think that that's, certainly something that's, not lost on.
How are we going to build a thriving city for everyone,
Yeah, given that land is a finite, thing, at least within a certain range of central Austin.
Yeah, on that sort of the interesting sort of thing where so many of the construction workers who have built the apartments in Austin can not even afford to live in them, so it's kind of forced out. I saw an article in the Statesman the other day that essentially that was what they were saying, but they weren't putting it as much for various reasons. The Austin American Statesman essentially was talking about the shortage of construction workers, and my whole thought reading the thing was like, well, construction workers can't afford to live here.
Right.
You have built a city in so many ways that construction workers cannot afford to live close enough to even come to the work that is being done. Part of me also wonders how much gentrification isn't just a new term for this much of the same phenomenon that's been going on or the same set of phenomena that's been going on for a couple hundred years at this point, where essentially, because it's definitely, as we said, it's not a matter of the number of housing units. It's not a matter of there not being enough housing units. I believe there are kind of 6 empty houses for every homeless person, or possibly even more than that. But that's the number I most recently saw, was that we have 6 empty housing or housing units sitting empty for every person without a home. So it's definitely, though, to me, it's also not about blaming people who move to a city.
Sure.
I mean, there are certain people who are just the most god awful people on earth who might move to a city. We have those here. But generally, as someone who's not native to Austin, I am here because there are jobs here. I could go back home to my very rural, deindustrialized hometown, and maybe, if I'm lucky, get a job at one of the 2 gas stations or the fast food restaurant. and be competing for those jobs with 50 other people or 100 other people or whatnot. So it's like you either have the rural areas of the country where it's like the housing is cheaper, but there's no jobs, or there's you can move to an urban area where there are more jobs. The jobs don't necessarily pay any better. The wages are still as depressed here as they are anywhere. But then of course the housing shoots up. So it's a crisis all around, that is really nothing that wasn't going on with kind of the urbanization of, I don't know, the 1800s or so. In many ways, I think the cities have become more fashionable, as opposed to at the time when the ruling class kind of lived in the countryside. The ruling class also kind of owns the countryside outside Austin too.
Mm-hmm. I think that whenever I think about gentrification, I don't just think about the reality of people getting forced out by rising property taxes, right? I mean, I definitely agree. I think that you've got kind of the right analysis, which is just that this is like one symptom of of economic inequality and capitalism and people's homes and things that people need, like healthcare, like everything else in our society, just being an investment vehicle and a way for capitalists to continue to make more money. But I mean, I think that it's also very relevant and very important to think about the social element of it as well, where you have a community where people sit out on their porches, and people, will have their kids playing in the yard, and then people know their neighbors, and people, maybe you live in an area where there's a lot of Spanish speakers. And if you're a Spanish speaker, that can be a sort of refuge for you. And whenever you've got, wealthier people who are culturally very dissimilar from you kind of moving into your community, who may or may not have their kids going to school because they may or may not have kids. So you don't have the same sort of social investment in institutions that you have, then you sort of see a lot of things in your community maybe fall apart or change. And so I think that even if you don't get forced out by property taxes, even if you're able to stay, as your neighborhood and community changes around you, you've still lost a home. You still kind of lost something that you were, that you played a role in building and that you watched the people around you build. So I think that is a sort of, I think that is a loss of gentrification. But I think that just whenever we think about community in America, right, like that's an interesting question. And I think that we don't tend to sort of value the community that could possibly be built outside of that single family home neighborhood context. And we value that kind of community far and above whatever kind of community might exist in a multi-story apartment unit complex or something like that. I think that it's very instructive for me to look outside of America and to look at how housing can exist in other places. And I would very much direct listeners to look at social housing in Vienna as a great example of how whenever we remove housing from the private market, which the majority of housing in the city of Vienna is publicly owned, you remove that upward pressure on rent. And if we are moving toward that rent-based model, right, which by all accounts it seems like that might be one solution. Let's kind of look at where it's been done. Let's look at how effective it can be at maintaining the cost of housing at a reasonable, affordable level to working people, and how it can actually be used to build real community. If you create communal spaces that are shared, then you do meet your neighbors because you're in those communal spaces. And it's not all about you having all the land that you need to do everything you want to do that's owned by just you, so you don't have to share it with anybody.
Yeah, I think there are solutions for kind of within the U.S. context. There's the sort of urban environment, there's the suburban, and then there's kind of the rural towns, and then there's also the farmland. And the truth is there are sustainable models for all of those. I think, two examples I always want to point people to would be, the Cuban example, I think, is the example par excellence of the real public, expropriation of land for the public good, because housing absolutely is a human right within the Cuban context. And people, people have a right to their homes in Cuba. They have a permanent right to their homes, to wherever it is they live, in a way that we have never had here. And then I think another example of where good things have started to happen is Venezuela, which of course has been under severe kind of not only economic attack, but we just found out the other day that the Trump administration was in talks with Venezuelan ex-military generals about trying to plot a coup there. So, certainly it's not in an ideal economic circumstance, but under the Chavez, the leadership of Chavez and later Maduro, massive public housing and public health facilities continue to be built. And I would also, for people interested in the Venezuelan communist system, the system of communes that can be found throughout. I believe there are, tens of thousands of these various kind of workers' communes that function essentially in some ways autonomously to decide what the needs of the communities are, that developed actually pre-Chavez, developed, under the kind of earlier neoliberal models in Venezuela before the kind of Bolivarian revolution. For people interested in looking at how that commune system works, they can check out the works of George Chichero Mar, who wrote Building the Commune. That's a really interesting book and a really good primer on, I think, what we're talking about in terms of like what is a socialized society, what can a communal space look like. One, of course, of many examples you can find throughout the world, as we've been talking about. So bring it back down to earth, bring it back down to Austin. Sometimes I don't know if Austin is on planet Earth, to be honest.
It's an open question.
Yeah, there are certainly people in Austin who live in space. So yeah, bring it back down to specifically this bond, the $250 million bond package, Proposition A, that's going to be put up for vote. We've been saying that a good portion of this is really set to be put aside for the public purchase of land for this use in affordable housing developments. And do you think that is kind of like the kind of top priority of making sure we have public housing, or how does this kind of parse out with the other with the other three major priorities here of affordable rent regulated apartments, affordably priced houses, and kind of home repair and rehab funds for homeowners?
That's kind of the foundation for the other three in some ways. I guess just in the sense that like that large investment in city-owned land, can kind of play a role, can feed into all those other three. Just because if we have city-owned land, we can build affordably priced, rented homes and potentially even community land trusts where, privately owned homes can reside on the land trust. If you're familiar with that concept, we can define it.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So community land trusts, or CLTs to save some syllables, that's basically a sort of structure where the land can be owned separately from the building sitting on the land. That's the simplest way that I've had it explained to me. So what that does is, let's just say we have a community land trust. Let's just say that Austin takes that money, part of that $100 million, and buys some land and establishes a community land trust. That allows either the city of Austin or perhaps maybe a nonprofit to own the land, and then whatever gets built on that land won't be subject to property taxes, right? So that increase in property tax that could displace a family or displace a person will no longer be a factor in their living situation.
Yeah, removing the speculation of land
exactly.
value from the cost of housing.
Oh, okay. So that's kind of like the foundation then for that particular part of this, upon which the rest of it rests.
Sure. I mean, Louis Conway Jr., one of the things that he is in support of Proposition A, and he is particularly excited about trying to use as much of that $100 million as possible just to build a community land trust, if I'm not misunderstanding his campaign there. But yeah, he's fired up about it. It's something that I think the material reality of the impact that this bond will have is thousands of permanently affordable homes will be built as a direct consequence of this vote and this proposition. So it's just, the Renter Development Assistance Program, that's something where, development projects that are, geared toward affordability will have the financing that they need in order to see the project through to completion. And that comes with this sort of string attached of those units, the units that will be built with that money can be like permanently protected from upward pressures on rent that would cause them to be unaffordable.
Yeah. So one technical thing about it is that it's not public housing. Like, it's not the same because of federal regulations that keep us from expanding traditional public housing programs. And unfortunately, Trump and Abbott are not going anywhere at the moment.
So we have to work around that, but we do.
So the bond is drastically expanding current city programs that are funding, or current city programs funding, and creates, and then that land acquisition program is entirely new. That's about as technical as I feel like I can speak to right now with the information that I have. I know that at the beginning of this campaign, there was some pull in a direction to try to describe exactly how the money is going to be spent and exactly what is going to be developed and where that's going to be developed. And outside of that promise of equity, I think at this point it is kind of open to it's going to be set up once the money is passed.
I guess for me, being a part of this movement, having joined this organization and built relationships with all the folks that I've met, it's been really transformational. I think that for me, socialism is just the right analysis, and that it's the analysis that pieced together all of these different parts of my own experience and the experiences of other people in my life who have struggled under capitalism, in a way that made sense, in a way that no other analysis has ever really, brought it together for me. So specifically as regards housing and Proposition A, I think that it would be very foolish to say that Proposition A is going to solve Austin's housing crisis, but I think that it does lay the foundation. I think that this is something where this campaign where we are targeting, areas and places that historically don't have high voter turnout, because we are trying to politicize people. We're trying to mobilize people. We're trying to engage people who are not targeted by these things. As a consequence of which, by the way, the interests of homeowners are disproportionately represented at the polls, right? We're trying to push back against that. In building a mass working class movement, part of our strategy is to reach the people that nobody else feels are, worth reaching. And I think that Proposition A is really exciting. Being in DSA is really exciting. And I think that looking at housing the way that we do, this lens that looks at the basic needs of human beings as being foundational, as being essential, as being something that absolutely must be provided by the community, by the state, whatever apparatus it is that we're talking about, and should not exist as an investment vehicle for capitalists. That lens is transformational, and I think that it's been a real privilege to kind of learn with these folks and go after this stuff. I think we're going to win. I think we're doing the right stuff,
I think there are some really interesting things in the work here.
Yeah.
And, it's been nice to finally get to kind of talk this out and see what the housing bond is all about. So, we have been joined for this episode by Marina Roberts and Maddie Detelich, who are the co-chairs of the Housing Committee of the Austin chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Thank you both once again for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. Thanks for hosting a great show.
Yeah, it's been great.
Pleasure's all mine. That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.